I've loaded a large flat brush and I'm painting the raw sienna wet into wet in the middle of the sky and down towards the horizon, leaving some gaps where I will paint pale blue washes. I am loading my brush with the cobalt blue and I am painting the sky wet into wet at the top of the painting, and just applying smaller strokes using the Cerulean wet into wet in the middle of the sky, sort of avoiding the raw sienna so the paint doesn't turn green. Painting a little bit more cobalt blue at the top left hand side of the sky here, wet into wet, adding a little bit of Cerulean as it goes towards the middle of the sky. I'm now tilting my painting to allow the paint to blend. It creates some lovely atmospheric effects, making the sky look a little bit more natural, collecting puddles at the bottom there. Tilting the other way just to get the paint blending and moving. Painting a little bit more of that cobalt blue at the top, damp into wet. So I've mixed up a slightly thicker cobalt blue, again tilting, getting that paint moving. The sky at the top should be darker because that's nearest to us and should be paler on the horizon so it looks further away, and that will create depth in your painting. I'm going to mix up some of the quinacridone gold with the cerulean, slightly creamy. And I'm going to paint this on the horizon for the distant trees, damp into damp. So as you saw there, I took off the excess paint on the paper towel and I'm using my size 8 brush to paint these distant trees. Varying the heights, adding a little bit more of the raw sienna here, damp into damp, just to create a little bit of colour variety. Dropping in a little bit of the cobalt blue mixed with the raw sienna here at the bottom of the trees, just to create a little bit of dark, and painting sort of smaller trees just as it goes into the centre of the painting there. If you notice, it's running up a little bit, so I'm actually tilting the other way so that the trees don't run up too much into the sky, and I'm tilting sideways as well so the sky doesn't look like it's raining. So this is all while the painting is still quite damp, and I'm just taking off the excess paint there at the edge of the paper using a clean damp brush. Just using my paper towel now just to mop up that little leak on the horizon. I am mixing up some Paynes grey here with a pinch of the raw sienna, and I'm painting this dark, damp into damp on the horizon to create some darks there, and that'll be a real nice contrast between the white of the snow and the trees above. I am mixing up a little bit more of that Paynes grey and just adding a touch more dark using my size 6 round brush, damp into damp. I'm using the plastic card to draw out some of that dark paint to pull it up into the damp paint. You can also scratch the surface of the paper as well, but this is permanent. You'll have a permanent scratch, but the paint will run into that scratch to create dark, thin lines. If you don't want to do that, you could actually paint dark, thin lines wet on dry later. So while the sky is still damp, I'm going to paint the trees on the left, damp into damp, just the foliage, just as a starter underpainting. And I'm mixing up a couple of greens, one with quinacridone gold with a little bit of the cobalt blue at the bottom there, and I've got cobalt blue with yellow, any yellow will do, just above. I'm using a large round brush. I'm painting damp into damp using the belly of the brush so the paint doesn't pour out. So to use the belly, just have the brush almost horizontal to the paper, and I'm just creating large sort of marks there in the sky area, leaving gaps. This is the quinacridone gold with the cobalt blue, so it's a little bit more warmer sort of colour, and I'm just applying that damp into damp there. Add a little bit more blue. Have you noticed in the palette it's not a puddle, there's not a lot of water in there, because otherwise if it's too watery you'll create cauliflowers in your sky. So I'm just varying the colours here. I'm mixing up some burnt sienna here with a little bit of the cobalt blue. You can literally see there's hardly any water in there, and I'm painting the tree trunk damp into damp with my size 6 brush, and I'm just sort of painting it through the foliage there, keeping it sort of really loose, and taking the excess paint off as well. If you're worried about doing this, don't. You can paint this wet on dry later, but it's just a nice way of painting the sort of foundations here of the trees, working damp into damp, painting some of the branches as well, damp into damp, and you can swap to a smaller brush. I'm sprinkling on some table salt onto the damp paint to create some lovely texture once dry. So it's a sort of a base coat here, and it's soft, and what happens is when you paint wet on dry later, which I will do, it will make the tree look more 3D because the wet on dry textures will come forward and these soft fuzzy sort of shapes and marks will recede, and it will create the illusion of depth. So just painting some smaller branches here, damp into damp, using my Reservoir brush, but you could use a small round brush, a rigger or a liner brush. What I'm doing now is I'm using a plastic card to swipe off some of the paint. You may need to practice this, but I'm sort of doing it on top of the branches to give the illusion of snow, but also to create texture on the tree trunks there. So I'm swiping sideways to create the illusion of bark. And I am going to lift off now, as you can see, swiping off the paint. The paint has to be damp, not wet, otherwise the paint will run back in on itself. So do practice this technique, but it's giving the illusion of lighter branches, but also snow on the branches as well. If you are worried about doing this, don't worry. I will have an alternative to this later in this tutorial. So I'm going to paint the smaller tree in the distance there. I've mixed up cobalt blue with burnt sienna, hardly any water, and I've taken the excess paint off on the paper towel. Using the size 8 brush and the belly of the brush, I'm painting damp into damp, so the sky is still damp. Now if your sky has dried off, don't worry, just maybe add a little bit more water to that wash, but still take the excess paint off on the paper towel. Paint wet on dry, and this paler wash will give the illusion that that tree is much further away. I've mixed up burnt sienna with Paynes grey. I'm using my size 2 round brush, and I'm painting the tree trunk and branches damp into damp. Again, remember to take the excess paint off on the paper towel. You can do the same thing wet on dry. And I'm just adding a few branches here, damp into damp. As you notice, I've got my painting sideways. I always quite like to sort of shift my paper around when I'm painting trees, etc. So I get more natural looking tree trunks and branches and foliage, of course. And again, I'm lifting off using the plastic card. Remember, the paint has to be damp. And just try to swipe once. Don't go back and forth because you could scuff your paper. I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. I'm going to paint the foliage and bushes on the left hand side. So I'm mixing up a variety of different greens. This is an earthy green, quinacridone gold, a little bit of yellow, touch of burnt sienna. This is cerulean with some yellow. At the bottom I've got some raw sienna, and I'm just adding a little bit more cerulean here just to get a little bit of a brighter green. I've also got some Paynes grey with quinacridone gold there as the darker green. So I'm using a large flat brush and I'm sort of scrubbing on the different greens here and there. It doesn't have to match the photograph, but I just want to create this variety, painting wet on dry here. And I'm using sort of different marks, different angles, etc. And I've swapped to a size 8 round brush here, just applying this lovely warm sort of colour here, the raw sienna, and I've added a pinch of burnt sienna in there as well, and just sort of painting thinner grasses. And again, sort of changing the angles here and then. This is all kind of wet on dry, and then I'll drop colours in wet into wet. I'm just working at the bottom of those grasses and bushes there, sort of using a bit of dry brush, so you've got that contrast with the white of the snow as well. I'm using my plastic card just to draw out some of that wet paint on to the background there, but also lifting off and swiping with the card to create lighter grasses. So lots of different sort of textures here, creating lots of variety and interest. And I've mixed up Paynes grey with a pinch of the quinacridone gold. I'm using my size 2 round brush and I'm just painting dark marks and grasses, damp into damp, just to create those real dark shadows to create depth in this area. Just lifting out a few more grasses. I've decided to add a little bit more of the raw sienna here, damp into damp in this corner. And I'm spattering some Hansa Yellow Deep to create some warm colours and textures. I am wetting the snow area with a large mop brush. And I'm also swishing it into some of those darker marks to soften them and make them look more natural. Painting the shadows on the snow using a large brush with a mixture of cobalt blue with a pinch of red. In some areas it's wet into wet, others it's kind of wet on dry, so you get that lovely sparkle in the snow, especially on the right hand side there. So just sort of painting up to the horizon but leaving a white gap there to create that illusion of snow. You kind of want to exaggerate it. I'm painting darker marks in the snow using a mixture of burnt sienna and Paynes grey using my size 6 round brush, painting damp into damp, so bigger marks in the foreground and gradually getting smaller as it goes towards the horizon. Don't be afraid of the dark. This will make your snow and the shadows in the snow more believable. So I'm just adding a few darks just here and there, a little bit more Paynes grey right in that foreground there to really create the illusion of depth. A few more dark marks, adding a bit of more burnt sienna and using the belly of my brush now to create textures, and that will be at the bottom of the fence posts. So bigger marks in the foreground, smaller as it goes away. I've swapped to my size 2 round brush now and just sort of painting grasses and varying the colours, using some of the colours I used on the left hand side, but just using sort of more darks and details just here and there, having fun just painting these sort of abstract marks here. And just using that dark there and just painting around the edge of those bushes and the grasses in the foreground here and there, just building up, working damp into damp, building up the detail, especially in the foreground. I wasn't happy about this dark here. It came forward too much and was distracting. So I'm just spritzing it off with my spritzer bottle and tilting and just taking the excess water off and paint off with a paper towel. And then just adding a few more marks on top there to make it look more natural. And again, adding a few more marks here and there using my size 2 round brush. And if you like to create some more textures on the foliage on the left hand side, you could sprinkle some salt. And then allow your painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. I am brushing off all the salt now with a paper towel. And I'm going to paint some darks in the bushes here on the left using some Paynes grey with a little bit of burnt sienna. And I'm painting wet on dry with my size 8 mop brush, using the tip of the brush to create thinner, smaller grasses just here and there at the bottom to create some shadows. I've got a little bit of phthalo blue in there to create sort of darker, more interesting greens using the quinacridone gold and the burnt sienna, painting marks here, wet into wet, just building up the darks and the details here and there. Adding a little bit of burnt sienna here, damp into damp with a bit of the Paynes grey and phthalo blue. And I'm starting to paint the lower part of the tree trunk using this dark, wet on dry, using my size 8 brush, just gradually sort of building up this sort of dark here. Adding a little bit more of the Paynes grey and burnt sienna and painting in sort of vertical brush strokes to create the texture of the sort of bark of the tree, but also cutting into the foliage there so you get a kind of a nice natural edge. And I'm using the plastic card to scratch into the damp paint to reveal the light underneath. This will create obviously light and texture. So building up the tree trunk here to the right hand side using the burnt sienna and Paynes grey, and again using the same technique, sort of vertical brush marks to cut into the foliage here and there. I'm painting branches now wet on dry from the trees, the larger branches, and these come forward away from those sort of fuzzy branches I painted in the first stage, as you remember. As you can see, it really kind of creates depth here, gives the illusion of a sort of a 3D tree, as it were. So just sort of painting here, wet on dry, building up using a swordliner brush, which is kind of a long flat brush, and it's sort of cut sort of from the middle of the brush hairs to the top at an angle, so the top of the brush almost becomes like a rigger brush, so it carries lots of paint and you get a lovely sort of thin line as well. So that's fun to use, sort of not unlike the Reservoir brush, where you've got the brush hairs at the bottom carrying most of the paint, and you've got that sort of thin brush at the top giving you the finer details. So that was quite fun to use, but you could use a twig as well to paint this sort of smaller branches. So just continuing on here, painting the branches wet on dry using the Paynes grey and burnt sienna. As you can see, I've turned my painting upside down, and I'm actually using a rigger brush just to paint the very small branches and twigs here carefully at the edges of the branches. And here I'm just painting lots and lots of quite sort of smaller, thinner lines coming from the branches, not being that careful, just giving the illusion. And it's quite a pale colour, so it's a watered down burnt sienna and Paynes grey. And again, going back in and painting some sort of slightly darker sort of branches and twigs there, a little bit more carefully, going over some of the sort of bigger branches here just to finesse them using this rigger brush, building up those details. Next, I'm going to paint the fence. I'm actually going to simplify it from the photograph. I'm mixing up Paynes grey and burnt sienna, painting wet on dry. I'm using my size 8 brush, and I'm just painting posts, just literally with one brush stroke, and they're getting smaller as they go towards the horizon. And I'm just going to finesse them now, making them slightly bigger, especially in the foreground. So it's taller and it's wider than the one next to it. And one by one, they will get shorter and smaller and narrower until they almost sort of disappear. I'm also kind of letting them lean a little bit as well to look a little bit more weathered rather than the more sort of very sturdy fence in the photograph. I'm using the rigger to paint almost like a wire going through the fence rather than wood, just to make it a little bit easier and more natural looking, not so formal. And I'm using the plastic card just to swipe off some of the paint to create light and texture, and doing the same on the top of the fence post to create the look of snow. Adding a little bit of detail here just underneath the posts in the distance using a dilute burnt sienna with a pinch of cobalt blue using my rigger. Getting a little bit more of that colour to paint some smaller grasses here and there. And then adding some of the wire there to the posts in the distance. And again, adding a few more darks and details here and there on the post using my rigger brush. You can use a liner brush, but it's just to finesse those fine details here and there. And it all depends how much you want to say. So if you want to really make it more of a realistic painting, you can just keep adding details. So I'm just adding a few more grasses here and there. I thought it'd be quite nice to sort of paint some bigger sort of plants just behind the fence post here, and also add just burnt sienna to paint that in wet on dry as well, using that rigger brush to create some warmer sort of marks that sort of come forward again to sort of create depth in the painting. And then just adding a few more darks using the Paynes grey mixed with the burnt sienna here just to build up the darks and the details. And of course, using the plastic card to lift off some of those darks there to create lighter marks and textures. And I'm just mixing up a limey green here using Quin Gold, the Hansa Yellow Light and a pinch of Cerulean. And I'm spattering that over the sort of tree area, but also the bushes here to the left using my size 8 brush. So it creates lovely light textures. So I have squeezed out some white gouache. I'm using that rigger brush and I'm painting the top of the posts here with the white paint to create the look of snow. And that's for those of you that maybe didn't want to swipe off the paint using the plastic card. You could actually, if you have just watched this video once through, you could actually mask this out with masking fluid. But I decided today, or on this particular tutorial, I would just stick with the swiping, card swiping and white paint. So I'm just sort of painting sort of quite a dry brush effect. I haven't put much water or any water into the paint there. And I'm just scrubbing it on to the post to look like sort of little snowflakes settling on the posts there. And I am painting the branches here wet on dry with the white paint to give the impression of the snow resting on those branches there. Doing the same on the branches on the left hand side there. My advice is to use white gouache rather than white watercolour, but if you only have white watercolour you might need to do a couple of layers. I find white gouache is very opaque, and as long as you don't add water to it and just use it straight from the tube, you can get some lovely effects here to create the look of snow. So I've added a little bit of raw sienna in with the white there. I'm just painting some lighter grasses here and there with the rigger brush. You can use a liner brush or just a small round brush just to add these lights here and there. Remember, make your marks smaller as they go off into the distance, bigger as they come into the foreground. And I'm just sort of adding these details into the sort of foliage on the left hand side there in the darker areas as a kind of a contrast as well, and it's really effective. And you can vary the colours, so you might want to add quinacridone gold or even a limey green with the white paint to create these lighter grasses and details. And I've just watered down the white now because you need to do that if you want to spatter. Remember to protect your sky as well from the spattering. And I'm just spattering using my size 8 brush, these light colours to create the look of snow or just light textures and details to finish off my painting. And here is the finished painting. I've removed the washi tape to reveal a lovely white border, and I must say I really enjoyed painting this winter scene. If you would like to get access to the extended tutorial and outline sketch, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon, and you will also get access to my exclusive tutorials. And you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.